Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions podcast. I'm Barbara Albert, co-CEO of 100% Renewables, a consultancy specializing in the development of net zero strategies. Today we're speaking with Austral Fisheries. Austral Fisheries is Australia's leading integrated commercial seafood business with a reputation for providing quality, sustainably caught seafood products to customers around the world for over 50 years. The company's operations span 3 wild catch fisheries from the sub-Antarctic, where Patagonian toothfish are caught in the world's most inhospitable conditions, to the tropics of the northern finfish and northern prawn fisheries, where gold-band snapper and various prawn species are caught respectively. Austral was an early adopter of third-party sustainability certification, and its premium wild-caught brands, including Glacier 51 toothfish, Skull Island tiger prawns, and Caramba banana prawns, are all independently certified as sustainable by the Marine Stewardship Council. In 2016, Austral became the first certified carbon-neutral seafood business in the world, offsetting the emissions of its entire business by planting over 1 million trees. Joining me today is Austral's CEO, David Carter. David has worked his entire career at Austral Fisheries and its predecessors. After graduating from Melbourne University in 1978 with a marine science degree, David's first job was as a deckhand on a prawn trawler off the coast of Darwin. This was the beginning of his 44-year career in the fishing industry. David has a strong commitment to sustainable science-based fisheries management. He has helped numerous fisheries achieve sustainability certifications with the Marine Stewardship Council. He campaigned and battled against Patagonian toothfish poachers to completely eradicate them from Australian toothfish fisheries. He collaborated with NGOs such as WWF to improve global seafood sustainability standards, and in 2016 led Austral Fisheries to become the first carbon-neutral seafood company in the world. David was inducted into the National Seafood Industry Hall of Fame in 2012, and in 2020 he received the Marine Stewardship Council's Lifetime Achievement Award. Hi, David, and welcome to the Driving Net Profit with Zero Emissions show.
Thanks, Barbara.
So climate change increasingly affects so many areas of our lives, and it certainly affects our oceans, with more than 90% of the warming that has happened over the last 50 years occurring in our oceans. This warming has multiple negative impacts such as sea level rise, thinning ice shelves and sea ice, coral bleaching, acidity, and so on. These effects have negative impacts for life on land, including coastal ecosystems and people who depend on marine fisheries for work and food, for example. And more than 3 billion people in the world rely on wild-caught and farmed seafood as a significant source of animal protein. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 85% of marine fish stocks are either fully exploited or overfished. And according to the World Wildlife Fund, many fisheries throughout the world throw away more fish than they keep. And there is also the problem of incidental catch of non-target species, known as bycatch, which is harmful to many species, such as turtles and dolphins. Pollution from poorly managed and unsustainable seafood farms have caused the deterioration of coastal habitats, lakes, and rivers. And then, of course, commercial fishing consumes large amounts of diesel to operate, which further exacerbates climate change. So given all these issues, I'm really excited to be interviewing you today, David, about how Austral Fisheries is leading the way when it comes to sustainable seafood and carbon neutral operations. David, what can you tell us about Austral Fisheries?
Austral Fisheries has been around 50 years. We're involved in wild capture fisheries from Australia's northern tropics in prawns and snapper fisheries through to the sub-Antarctic territories. We turn over about $130 million a year, and as of today, I think about 19 boats involved in those 3 different fisheries. I think consistent through that journey has been a broad commitment to best practice in fisheries management. So it's having a good handle on the science around sustainability, the impacts broadly on ecosystems of those operations, and then good governance. And married into that as well as a respect for and a cooperation with NGOs that take an interest in the way these resources are run. And then we sort of wrap all that up with some luxury sort of provenance branded products that attempt to create a connection between the things that we value and those customers who value the things we value.
So in previous conversations, you mentioned to me that you see yourselves as a steward of the ocean. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a little bit trite. Sometimes I'll even be so cheeky as to suggesting that we can be better conservationists than conservationists. But I think the best practice fisheries management involves strong access rights. So the property right in fisheries management is critical in aligning the self-interest of the operator, ourselves, with the expectations of the community. So if we view that these access rights are ours in perpetuity, that we're there for a long time, as it would be if you owned your own house or you owned your own farm property, then you're going to look after it. So you're going to want to understand what is going on, what are the impacts that you're having, and really preserving those key values in a way that sets you up for the long term. So this business has a balance sheet loaded with the intangible assets that reflect the value of those access rights, and when you frame it in that way, it's just dumb to go and be anything other than a steward. And so I find us advocates for sensible use and certainly protection of those ocean or that Australian marine estate.
You're a very purpose-driven individual. I watched your TEDx talk in which you described your journey to a carbon neutral business and your own personal journey. So can you take us through those moments in your life when you realized personally that something needed to be done about climate change and the catalyst that made you take action as a business?
It's really an evolution, Barbara. The latest chapter around climate's been the end of a whole series of commitments to really evidence-based decision making. My history includes a science degree, the trajectory around an understanding of what's going on in fisheries, the embrace of third-party certification around sustainability, the work that we've done in tackling illegal fishing, broader activities for getting excess capacity out of fisheries. It's a continuum. And so we got to the point where we'd felt that we'd done all the obvious things, and we were a bit restless as to what does a leading business do next after having fisheries certified and doing the things that we were doing. And at about that time, I had the opportunity to visit the Antarctic in a trip that was quite extraordinary.
How long ago was that? When was that trip?
This was 2015. So it was at that time, if you recall, the Australian political debate around climate was quite toxic and highly divisive, and that was pissing me off. But it was also at a time when division was flowing through into polite conversation. So if you raised concerns about climate at a barbecue, then it was like you were instantly labelled as one of those, you're one of those mad greenie tree hugging types. I still want to drive my ute on the weekend, right? But it was that trip to the Antarctic, number one, where it was just an incredible kind of sensory experience. But number two, it was with a bunch of people who simply accepted that climate change was real, who were very comfortable in talking about the challenges. And we were confronted as a group firsthand with the changes that were taking place in this special place. And so I left that trip thinking, okay, I have to talk about this more. What can I do? It started as something I was thinking I should do individually as a citizen, and that didn't quite have the impact. And then it became an obsession as to how can I turn this into something for the business to pursue. And it was through really a vigorous year of investigation and conversations with many people that I realised that indeed there was an opportunity for us to really have our voice on something that we were seeing firsthand was impacting our world. So the commercial realities for this business are that we live in nature. We operate within functioning ecosystems really uniquely to any other sector of industry. And we are seeing and witnessing firsthand the rate at which climate and oceans are changing. And so it seemed to be a really natural connection. So if we're going to be here, we're going to be contributing to further emissions through burning diesel, and we want to see a change, then it would be churlish of us to simply complain about it if we weren't prepared to do something. And so we were able to build a case and convince our board that that was an opportunity. Not necessarily. It wasn't the stick. It was the carrot. So we saw an opportunity to do the right thing, and then also serve shareholders' interests. So there's another whole discussion point about some of that sort of thing.
Definitely. I want to dive deeper into that. So you mentioned 2015 was your trip to the Antarctic. That's also the year that the Paris Agreement got signed by Australia. Has that played a part in your feeling the permission to openly talk about climate change as well?
Yeah, I think so. And it was really just within weeks of that Paris Agreement that we were able to get board approval. So 2015 was that busy year of exploration, building a case, and then getting agreement for action from the business's point of view. And if anything, COP21, it kind of added urgency for me. Something like, oh my, I've got to get in here first before somebody else discovers this really good idea I've had and beats me to it. But of course, all these years on, and as I look across indeed the global fish business, we're still the only fishing company that have done what we've done, and that's all those years on. So I do feel to some extent we've failed in that leadership role in not having followers without followers there can be no leaders, Barbara. So yes, this is still very much unfinished business.
Definitely. And you also mentioned before that you're seeing the impacts of climate change on nature, on the oceans firsthand. So you saw that when you went to the Antarctic, and of course in your everyday business operations, you must see those impacts. Can you tell our listeners more about the kinds of impacts that you're actually seeing with your own eyes, because you're so close to nature?
So we're not involved in any of the sort of barrier reef stuff, but coral reef bleaching is well reported. Less well reported are mass die-offs of Abyssinia mangroves in the western Gulf of Carpentaria during that marine heatwave event of 2015, 2016. Equally in the subantarctic where we're working, that same heatwave event resulted in some quite dramatic catch rate declines for us, and that's triggered a bunch of additional work that we've done in looking at more broadly system changes from oceanography to kinetic energy and temperatures in the system, and then of course the way that plays out on those species of interest to us, directly commercial interest, and then the other ecosystem functions that support those species. Beyond that, in the global fish world, we see an overwhelming move towards the poles by many pelagic species. big parts of Europe and North American fisheries have seen stocks of capelin and others sort of wholesale shifting from one jurisdiction to another. The risk of assets being stranded around the Aleutians as pollock moves to closer to the poles down the east coast of Australia. A broader shift of species, more and more tropical species recorded across the eastern seaboard of Tasmania. So it's real, happening all over the place.
So you came back from that trip and you wanted to do something in the business, but of course there are so many stakeholders to engage and to persuade of the need of action. Was that an easy thing for you to do? How hard was it to convince the board and other stakeholders in the organization to move down that path?
Surprisingly easy, I suppose. We're blessed. I am blessed. This business is a private business. The shareholders are well tight-knit group. 50% of our business is owned by a Japanese enterprise, and they've been fabulous partners. And they've probably never seen anything quite like us, but they've come to appreciate the work that we've done and the results that we've produced. It was surprisingly, I won't call it easy, but it's not as cumbersome in a private business like that, like us, as you might imagine. And I think that talks more broadly to other issues for sustainability. So we generally play the long game. We don't have to report to a quarterly public company reporting cycle. We can take judgments that really transcend that cycle, understand that seasons and natural systems produce variable results. I have been in a situation where we've made a judgment to leave a whole bunch of fish uncaught, have quite a negative impact on profitability, and we've made that call based on what we've felt is in the long-term interest of the fishery. And it's been a privilege to have the support of the board in taking that position. Now, if I was in a listed company, the risk would be my head would be on a stick. Shareholders would be baying for blood, or commentators would be issuing sell orders. So we're playing the long game. And for any of the listeners that have picked up a copy of Simon Sinek's Infinite Game, then that's a bit of a guiding piece. And it's definitely it's kind of a privilege of the position I find myself in, where we can play the long game and we deliver long-term shareholder value. We don't have to worry about the next quarterly cycle.
Definitely. I'm also a big fan of Simon Sinek myself. We'll put a link to the Infinite Game and perhaps also start with the why. Simon Sinek, both books, the author, into the show notes of this episode. David, your organization has been carbon neutral since 2016. You have certified both your organization and your products and your public disclosure statements. So these are statements that can be found on the web, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well. Your public-facing statements provide lots of open and detailed information about the work that you do, but also the challenges that you face to reduce your carbon footprint. Now, in your industry, you have led from the front on the critical issue of climate change. Can you tell us a bit more about what showing up for climate response means and looks like in your organization?
Talking about it, number one. That was a revelation early days. I think for many in the industry, many in the community even, it was an inconvenient truth, to use an old term. It's like if we don't talk about it, it's not there. Let me put my head in the sand. So to cite another great author, Jim Collins, it's confront the brutal facts. And there's some fairly brutal facts that need to be confronted in this case. And so really just having that conversation, drawing those discussions out. And I think given our role, we've been able to give others permission to be thinking about these things, and there's a lot to think about. And whether that's from operators and investors or bankers or insurance companies, there's implications that and regulators, there's implications that rattle around in all sorts of ways that we're still yet to really guess at. So that's open your mouth, have your say, and then it's amazing what happens.
Yeah, not be silent about it. So one of the key messages at 100% renewables that we try to get across to our clients and to others is that a goal to reach net zero emissions can be profitable when done right, and it doesn't have to be an added cost. And in your climate active public-facing documentation, you say, done correctly, being carbon neutral can be a profit center, not a cost center. This aligns perfectly with how we believe businesses can benefit in this whole transition. Can you tell us a bit more about how your leadership on climate benefits your business's bottom line?
It's an interesting thing. We seek to unlock the value of our values through brands. So the brands allow us to talk about things that are important to us. I learned a long time ago that we do the best business with people who share our values, and I've got another whole rich seam of stories on that front. But if you can create that community, then people who understand where we're coming from and are up for passing that on are better able to unlock the premium that we put into that product that we sell. So it is about the storytelling. I think it would be difficult if you were a fishing company just providing a commodity to turn that value into a profit, and that's not a problem we've had. So we're focusing on a premium product, a brand with a lot of storytelling buried in that brand, and brands kind of embody a whole bunch of values. The hard to know how someone might describe our brands. I would personally hope that it is, as we spoke earlier, it's around our commitment to stewardship of the oceans, our voice in support of sustainable use, and then all of the things that go with that, whether it's evidence-based decision-making on fisheries management outcomes, and now more recently, the obvious commitment to climate. They are bundled up, and people do ask me, well, how do you attribute that part of the brand that is your climate action versus that part of the brand that is your the fact that you're MSC certified? And there's many issues in our business, in the industry. You can talk about bycatch, you can talk about illegal fishing, you can talk about labour practices, animal welfare. There's a checklist of things that this business is no different from any other, where every industry has its social license challenges. Overall, I'm proud of the brands that we've produced and the premiums that they earn, and they do that, in my view, off the back of the strong ESG performance that we've fought for a very long time to deliver.
Several questions fall from this. So firstly, can you explain to our listeners what it means to achieve MSC certification?
MSC is the Marine Stewardship Council. It was kicked off as a love child of WWF and Unilever back in the late 90s. We were, in fact, the world's first commercial supporter of the initiative outside of Unilever. My then boss was on the foundation board for the organisation. A number of folks in our world at that time felt that that was dangerous business. You know, you're feeding the crocodile, encouraging these nasty greenies. But it was like, what's not to love? So here it is, an international NGO looking to celebrate the things that we were already doing around governance and science and ecosystems performance, and packaging that in the way that provided a consumer-facing piece of messaging that delivered a premium. And so that became really important. And that that initiative now represents or has coverage of in the order of 22% of global seafood production. And in many cases, it's the ticket to ride. So for major corporate supermarkets globally, unless you can supply an MSC certified seafood, you don't get in the door.
You mentioned earlier that once you had all these certifications for your products, the MSC certification, carbon neutrality, etc., and attaching that to the brand came with the biggest value for your organization. So who's actually your customer?
It's really the customers for us. Ultimately, our first line customers are the importers or the wholesalers or the supermarkets. But we do a lot of work behind those with building brands, creating like all of the social media, the Instagram, the Facebook. That sort of that brand character comes from really direct engagement with would-be consumers. And as a strategy, I think that works well. So we create that draw from consumers, the recognition, and that allows our supply chain partners to really perform that facilitating intermediary role. So in the US, for example, I've got a dear and very supportive customer who shares with us on many of the trade show and other marketing activities, but again, directly benefits from the collateral we create through social media.
So would that be a general recommendation from you to others to generate collateral to make sure that the storytelling happens? Because it's not just enough to do all these things, but you need to communicate that to the marketplace so that the value can be seen, because customers will only purchase things where they can see value. So if you're not able to communicate the value that this brings, then your customers just wouldn't see that value, wouldn't pay for that.
I think that's right. You need to have a communication strategy. Everybody will do it different. I make no secret of the way we've gone about it. How we've responded has been unique to our circumstance, our customers, our products. I don't seek to lecture others as to how they should do this or that. It needs to be very personal. Again, my dear mentor would remind me that I can give you the flight manual for the A380, but there's no guarantee you'll get it off the ground. So you have to figure that out for yourself. But it starts with inquiry. It starts with asking yourself the question, in my circumstance, what can I do?
Yes, and I think everyone's kind of on a journey. You went on this journey, and then by you changing your business practices, offering carbon neutral products, MSC certification, etc., this then causes a chain of events, because your customers, your suppliers will then take note of your efforts and then will reflect back to their own business practices and see whether they need to change anything, or will then preference your product because it comes with all these added credentials. So it's kind of a learning journey that everyone's on, and I'm really glad that you're setting this example that then causes so many further beneficial actions. And the other question I had that came from our discussion was, you mentioned that there are so many different pools in your organization in terms of there's animal welfare, there's MSC certification, there's the climate change impact, there's carbon neutrality, carbon emissions. As a business, how do you prioritize all those different issues? I mean, you've nailed it pretty much across all of them, but how can other organizations do that, being faced with ESG, with reporting, all these issues? How do you go about prioritizing your first steps?
These things emerge, they evolve. And so social license for me, and this is about social license, right? So social license for me, I describe as having a really honest look at your dirty little secrets and then telling the world about them. Now, it's really unnatural. It's really unnatural. The first instinct is to cover them up. But in this world, to being real and raw and honest about where those activities and practices are that you may be not proud of, and everybody's got them, is the first step. And once you've done that, you've identified those practices, again, social license demands that you are raw, real, and honest about where you're at. So the first thing I would recognise is we are not perfect, but we are genuine in wanting to have a go. We listening to what's going on, and times change. So the whole social license thing is about listening to context and the reality of the world that we live in now. I mean, 18 months ago, we would have been obsessed with COVID, and we would have been talking about what we were doing to look after our people on fishing boats and those sorts of things. Now 40 years ago, when I started, it's actually a bit more than 40 years ago, Australia was still shooting whales. Doctors were still endorsing cigarette brands. So if we needed no reminder than that, times and community expectations change, and businesses need to be contemporary and to recognise those things. So in our trajectory, if you wanted to balance climate versus animal welfare, I would say, well, climate's a clear winner. It's not that animal welfare is not important. It's that the focus for animal welfare interests has primarily been on mammals and those thought to have more sensory perception of their pending demise. But equally, down the track, there's other things that could come and change that. So, like, no particular answer, but fundamentally, it's around ensuring that we are effectively communicating around those key issues.
I think what comes through is that you're just quietly going about implementing actions that solve all these issues. So you identify them and you take steps towards solving these issues. So that has been your mantra as you went along. And I think that's such a crucial lesson for others to learn, that just you need to be able to firstly identify the issues that affect you as a business, and then you keep chipping away until you're solving most of the issues. So I think that's absolutely commendable. So you mentioned earlier social license and being raw, being authentic, and not hiding your secrets, etc. That brings me to think about the carbon footprint, because of course, as a fishing operation, you must have, and you do have, many emissions. Could you talk us through the kinds of emission sources that a company like Austral Fisheries have?
Certainly no surprises. The major source of emissions that comes from burning diesel. So I've lost track, but generally it's in the order of 9 or 10 million litres of diesel a year. The next significant source has been the fugitive emissions from refrigeration plants. And perversely, some of those refrigerant gases have gone from the ozone-depleting styles, so those substances that were banned under the Kyoto Agreement have now been replaced with other refrigerant gases, which are very good for the ozone layer, but they're terrible. Have a terrible global warming potential. So some of these substances, freon gases, essentially, some of them can have global warming potential of 4,000, which means for every kilo of gas you lose is equal to 4,000 kilos of CO2. So again, the chemistry hasn't quite caught up. There are some new substances that can produce the job, but for lower GWP, and there's experimental gases that will get this down to, say, 600 as a GWP. And the next step, and this is a gas that we've included, it's a bit more challenging on a boat, but we've been converting our bigger boats to ammonia gas, which is a natural gas and has a very low global warming potential. So that's a general push. But if I'm looking at the emissions profile for the business, we started with the view that in 2016 it needed to be squeaky clean. So we went for a very, very comprehensive Scope 3 assessment. We include emissions in that assessment based on the provisions for all the meals that the crews eat, and that was another 800 tonnes a year. We had fuel that was used to catch the bait that we used to catch the toothfish. That was another 500 tonnes. We provided for the product that would be caught and shipped and consumed finally in New York, and even cooked on the grill in New York. So all of those things, we cast the net very wide. We were concerned that our early move would be viewed skeptically as a greenwash. And so we were keen to be extremely comprehensive in the way the Scope 3 emissions are accounted for.
And that's all evident in the public disclosure statement, which I encourage our listeners to have a read. It's very interesting. So just for our listeners, so that they can picture that better, the refrigerants that you have, that would be refrigeration equipment on the boats, right?
Correct.
So as the fish is being caught, it needs to be refrigerated. So that's where that comes from. So in 2021, you had roughly 45,000 tons of carbon emissions. So far, one of the highest you've seen so far. And it's evident your emissions are rising and dropping over the years. What are some of the major factors that make your emissions so variable?
Growth. What we've also done, apart from adding a few extra boats to the fleet, has been to begin to use, say, buy products from other operators. So in some ways, we're greening the broader industry by buying prawns, for example, from some of our not competitors, but fellow fishers, and putting them in our brand. And so when we do that, we account for the emissions that are involved in that. So if you like, there's more greening of the existing fleet. So it's not necessarily directly our emissions. On the other side of that, we've done a bit of work with replacing boats. So we built a hybrid electric vessel in Norway that delivered in 2020. She's a bit special. These are quite large boats for operating in the sub-Antarctic. She was about a $50 million investment, and we went to the Norwegians because they've been very expert at improving fuel efficiencies, embracing many of the technologies that we need to help decarbonise the maritime business anyway. And this particular boat is more like a Prius in the fishing boat world. So she's got a load-shaving battery and some clever drivetrain features, but she still uses diesel, and we'll talk about diesel in a little while. But volatility and some of those improvements have, as I said, just been increasing activities.
So the vessels that you purchase, it's such a significant capital investment for your business, and you must have such a long-term view when buying these assets, and climate change, of course, plays a great role, and potentially an external future carbon price, but you have an internal carbon price with the carbon offset, so that you purchase to become carbon neutral. So any investment decisions into those long-term vessels carry with them the offset costs, because if you are not efficient, then that means that your carbon offset obligations just rises. So makes a lot of sense to me. That hybrid electric vessel sounds really, really interesting. Other companies investigating similar things, say, for instance, international shipping companies?
There's a lot of work going on, not much in Australia, sadly. The Scandinavians probably leading the world, but there's developments in the US that's going to see that significantly step up, and there is a lot going on. I don't know if you want to dive into alternate fuels and where that's at now, but
I do actually, because you showed me the presentation that you delivered a couple of weeks ago about green methanol. And I've been thinking about that ever since, because a couple of episodes back, I interviewed transport experts on electrification and hydrogen. And the common suggestion was that for diesel fuel in shipping, that's going to be replaced with hydrogen. But in your presentation, I saw that there are multiple options that can be evaluated, such as hydrogen, biofuel, LNG, and ammonia. So I'm keen to find out more about all these different options, specifically for you guys, but also generally for the shipping industry, how these fuels can help solve the climate problem. So if you could briefly touch on all these different fuels, just for our listeners' benefit. And then specifically, I'm really keen to find out more about green methanol. So let's start with the others first. So hydrogen, biofuel, LNG and ammonia. Just very quickly, what's the difference? How do they work? What are the disadvantages, advantages over others?
Yeah, it's an interesting place. First of all, I'd say that in my view, aviation and maritime represent the great challenges for sectoral decarbonisation. So transport, grid electricity, a lot of that is pretty well mapped out, and there's not a lot of mysteries in it. But diesel is bloody good at what it does, and you think you've got all that energy embodied in such a dense medium, that makes it challenging. So I think the motor vehicle trends have seen that battery electric's super efficient, and that's it's got a high capex. You're paying a lot for batteries. Electric drives are beautiful, and that works really well. Potentially in shipping, short haul shipping, and this is where Norway's really charging ahead. They've now committed, and really the Norwegian government said no new contracts for inter-island ferries and that sort of thing unless there's a battery electric solution. So that's built this massive infrastructure and technical capability for throwing out diesel engines and diesel fuel tanks, replacing them with batteries, electric drives, shore infrastructure. So that's come a long way, and we're seeing some of these inshore container vessels and others with battery packs as big as 6, 7, 8, 10 megawatt hours of battery storage. For the fishing business, it's potentially a solution for day boats, inshore fisheries, that sort of thing, and it would deliver an extraordinarily low operating cost, but as I said, high capex to start. I find a lot of people instantly go to hydrogen for marine fuels for long haul. We've had a look at it. Hydrogen's a bugger of a thing. It's, apart from being the smallest atom in the universe, it's really difficult to contain. It'll get out of fittings and fixtures and storage. If you want any kind of density out of it, then it's either high pressure at 700 bar or liquefied. And to liquefy this, it's I don't know, something like 27 degrees Kelvin, which is just insane. And then containing this stuff on a boat, extremely challenging. The odd shaped containers, they've got to be spherical or just to deal with the pressures that are involved. And then you're dealing with a gaseous fuel. So how do you run that in an engine? It's probably more likely a fuel cell. And you just got all these problems, and it still doesn't have the energy density of some of these other fuels. So it's difficult. So I'm not a big fan for hydrogen used in that way as a feedstock for these other things that we're about to talk about. Absolutely, we need hydrogen. That's where it begins. But it's a shitty molecule on its own. The next stop for maritime's been ammonia. Now, ammonia is, again, it's a nitrogen atom and a few hydrogen atoms, and it's pretty good energy density, but it's a gaseous fuel, and in a ship, it's a nasty substance. People die when ammonia leaks out, and you've got to then figure out how you're going to use it. If it's going to be direct burn in a compression ignition engine, then how's that all work? There's still some nitrous oxides issues, and there's still containment. So you still are dealing with pressure vessels, not to the same extent that hydrogen would be. As a fuel, it's got similar properties to LNG in terms of temperatures and pressures, and at the point at which it's liquefied. But and there's a lot in shipping world that are quite keen on ammonia. But we got to methanol. So methanol, it's almost like liquid sunshine. So methanol, you need one carbon atom, you need one oxygen atom, and that allows you to bolt on 4 hydrogen atoms. As I said, it's liquid and stable at standard temperatures and pressures. It can be stored in legacy fuel tanks, so you don't have to build a new boat to make room for this stuff. It can be bunkered and shipped around as as we are used to now with diesel fuel, and that it can be burned in compression ignition reciprocating engines. So again, you've got a whole legacy fleet of boats, and a whole legacy pool of talent that are used to dealing with liquid fuels in this way. So to hand them a slight twist with methanol, it's not a big ask. The challenge with methanol then is it's less energy dense, so you need about 2.2 times as much of the stuff to generate the same amount of output or horsepower, and there's some particular requirements for engines, lubrication, temperatures and pressures in the combustion chamber, and some of that subtlety.
So how do you produce green methanol?
Right. Well, currently methanol comes from fossil fuel sources. Most of it globally is derived from natural gas or similar feedstock. To produce green methanol as a source of hydrogen, you need a source of carbon, and at this stage, early projects that we have seen on the table would use electrolyzer to create the hydrogen. The carbon would come from, say, waste streams in agriculture would be a source. There is another potential to use cheap carbon, say, from oil and gas operations. It's currently otherwise vented. That would be an option. And then down the track, as we get better at direct air capture, there's some quite viable technology, albeit still a bit expensive, to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. So all of that makes pretty good sense, and we just need to get to scale. So again, if the reality check for us is some of the leadership we're seeing from Maersk Shipping. They have invested heavily and committed heavily into methanol. The expectations are that within 12 years, they will replace 100 of their container fleet with methanol burning or dual fuel capable ships that will run on methanol and green methanol. They are now running around the world doing deals with project developers and writing offtake agreements to stimulate production of green methanol in advance of these ships coming online. And they're deadly serious. That there is a lot happening in that space.
And what about biofuels? Is that not a viable option?
I think so. My sense, though, is that biofuels run the risk of, as we get to scale on this thing, we either compromise food production capability, or we maybe deny the aircraft industry access to SAF, which is this sustainable aircraft fuel. So for aviation will probably require and be able to pay more for a biofuel than the maritime sector. And so it's kind of just, it feels like a bit of a stopgap short-term solution from my point of view.
Thanks for sharing your opinion on all those different fuels. Now let's talk about the measure of last resort being carbon offsets, because naturally, as a carbon neutral business, you, especially today, can't just go to carbon neutral status immediately. We always need carbon offsets as a bridge to cover that residual carbon footprint. So can you tell us more about your carbon offset strategy? Because I know that you are about more than just buying low cost offsets, and that you're looking for alignment with your vision and your strategy, and that you favor local permanent storage and biodiversity protection over others. Can you tell us more about how you're deciding, like what kind of carbon offsets you're purchasing and how this works?
We began with projects in the West Australian Eastern Wheat Belt. Just a terrific initiative. The chap that kicked it off put millions and millions into this business, essentially taking what was non-productive, broken, marginal wheat belt country, and it was salt affected. The soils impacted. pretty ugly stuff, but a full sort of at scale ecosystem restoration project. And I just love that country. That's desert country, and you can look at one side of the road where this stuff, what this country used to look like, and then after the planting of upwards of 40 different species collected from seed locally, and even within 5, 6, 7 years, low rainfall country, you've got insects and leaf litter and birds and the odd kangaroo or wallabies back in there, and just quite extraordinary. We've diversified a little bit. The business really, I think, is a more natural fit to things like blue carbon. There's some significant challenges with blue carbon, apart from the fact that there are not many. There may be only one, I'm not sure at the moment, of approved methodologies for blue carbon projects. They have the fundamental issues of preservation. So given that they are by definition coastal or estuarine, if you want to make sure that your investment in carbon offsets is going to be the real deal for a sensible period, and we really got to talk about preservation periods of 50 years, then in 50 years, as per your intro, increased acidification, ocean sea level rises, and increased storm frequency, or potentially put those projects at risk. So you could have the beautiful seagrass or mangrove restoration that lasts 10 years and sequesters a whole bunch of stuff, and then one storm event wipes it out, and you say, well, gee, what was that for?
Almost similarly to losing trees to a bushfire or to disease.
Yeah, I think so, but they're potentially more manageable, like a sea level rise or a storm for coastal environments. They're acts of, like truly acts of God stuff. I would argue that good land management would be able to seriously mitigate some of those risks. And we know with those projects, there's say with a gold standard certification, there's a portion of the credits that are, if you like, banked for managing that. But the other issue with coast and estuarine activities is actually who owns them. So is there clear title to that credit, and then is there clear title to the carbon title, or clear ownership or pathways to ownership for the carbon title? So it's not without its challenges. We are in the process of doing another bit of work. It's not quite public yet, but using a stapled credit with a kelp regeneration or replanting project. So some years ago, the West Coast here suffered a pretty significant loss of kelp across 110,000 hectares of coastline south from Kalbarri, and they just simply have not come back. So we're using some of that offset investment really as a way of experimenting with techniques for regenerating or re-establishing kelp species in that part of the coast. That's pretty exciting. I think quite novel. So we won't be looking for a kelp methodology, although that could be a consequence down the track. We invest in the offset, and there's a co-benefit, which is funding important work in developing techniques for improving kelp restoration, and then maybe down the track that also develops either a biodiversity credit or an additional, if you like, an extra carbon measurement.
And for our listeners who don't know what a stapled carbon offset is, could you explain that, please?
It's one of those cheaper credits that you buy that are still considered acceptable to the climate active certification that meets our compliance. That's a compliance obligation, and we pay a premium for the benefit of, in this case, being participants in what I think is really, really important, exciting work in recovering a big chunk of lost kelp.
So how would you recommend other companies develop their carbon offset strategy? Because you've devoted so much thinking into potential suitable offsets, you investigated blue carbon offsets, you're going for biodiversity and so many other different co-benefits. What's a good approach that other companies can follow to also make sure that their climate investment is a good strategy?
It's a tricky one. I don't claim we have the answer. Let's say if you've got to offset 100 credits, or you've got 100 tons to offset, you could buy 90 tons of cheapies and then 1 ton of some charismatic project that you make all the fuss about. I'm a bit wary of that sort of thing. That said, find a project that works for you, that connects, and tell authentic stories around that. The work that we've done in the wheat belt here, like, it's really been special to me. I've loved taking all of the staff up and spend a night out by the campfire and spending the day planting York gum seedlings and that sort of thing. That really it creates that conversation, develops that connection, and it's sort of got a co-benefit, which is the camaraderie that we build. But it's again such a personal thing. So yeah, make it your own, and particularly for leaders or folks that are leading the push on this, it can't be just a tick the box exercise. Like, get attached to the project, to the project developers and the outcomes, and then proudly tell your story. So it's still about connecting and creating more of who you are and what you stand for and what's important to you as part of that either that corporate brand or the product brand.
You mentioned that you had this staff day where you planted trees and you all went out and did that. So I'm curious to find out more about how staff perceives your efforts internally in the business. Do they feel motivated by your actions? Do they feel proud about their organization that they work for? Do they feel like they are brand ambassadors for Austral Fisheries because they get to work with such a forward-looking, climate active organization?
I think so. I don't run around and ask them. They appear to enjoy the experience. But cynicism aside, I think it does work. It is important. As my old mother used to say, Barbara, and this I liken to the climate challenge, is if you want to get your little problems in a perspective, go find yourself a big problem. So it's like fixing climate change would probably qualify for that. But I think apart from what we've done, corporate Australia, corporate world has moved on, where business leaders I think need to have a narrative bigger than themselves. And we saw Alan Joyce speaking loud and proud about marriage equality, for example. Now that was an example for me of a leader with a lot of skin in the game, as it were, a brand that sort of fits with all of that. And he was having his voice. He didn't have his head down. It's like, this is me. This is what I stand for. Cannon Brooks and the work he's done. I mean, there's many examples of businesses that are happy to make. They add their voice to the critical societal challenges of our time, and I think it's important. It's no longer acceptable for leaders just to stay stum and keep eyes internally in the business. We have to be relevant to more broadly what's going on in the environment, in the outward business and social environment, and ensure that we're relevant. And if we're able to do that, then we create, and I've never really been comfortable with this, but you might laugh when I'm saying this as we sit on a podcast with me talking about myself, but this has not been my natural place. Like, I have been dragged screaming from the doing in this business into the blah blah. So they talk about me as the officer in charge of Royal Waves and blah blah blah. So, but that communication piece is that's important for setting the tone, and And then once you've done that, you're creating a brand and a set of, you're really talking about a set of values that then speaks to the great challenge of business futures, which is attracting talent and capital. And if we can't find ways to attract talent and capital as businesses, our future is limited.
I certainly believe in the fact that purpose-led businesses that are values-driven will attract better talent and will attract capital easier than others, because that's the times we find ourselves in: authentic, real leadership. So people like you that lead will certainly have followers in terms of staff, other businesses, suppliers, your value chain that will follow your example. And I know throughout the podcast and throughout the interview, I've asked quite a lot of times, how would you recommend others do this, etc., etc. But I'd like for you to summarize it one last time for companies that are listening to this podcast. You've gone through an immense transformation as a business in terms of coming to the realization that this is an issue that needs to be tackled head on. You've looked at your emission sources, and not a small scope of emission sources, but extending it out to your full value chain, taking responsibility both for your organization's emissions as well as for emissions associated with your products, making sure that your carbon offset, your climate investment stacks up and aligns with your values, investigating options, how you can reduce emissions in the organization, bringing staff along on the journey, taking them to tree planting days so they can make the connection in real life to the kind of impact you're causing as an organization. So you've tackled so many issues so incredibly well. So I'm wondering if you were to put all of those things into recommendations that have like maybe simple steps that other organizations can take to also look at climate leadership, what would you recommend they do?
I think anybody that's taking the time to listen to this sort of material is already practicing in the language of and becoming fluent in this. It's not natural. There's a massive gap in this space now around people that understand how this all works, and the more we focus on those things, the better. As a business, the practical next steps are understand your own emissions, measure what it is that is your contribution to your business's emissions. Look at what you can do to reduce, so that again, that's all pretty obvious. There's some things that are easier. Get some easy wins. If it's putting solar panels on the roof or that sort of thing, then get on with it, and then start talking about it. But definitely that's that first step. And as soon as, and in my experience, as soon as people have made the cognitive switch, that's like, okay, this is something I need to do. This is now important to me in the business. I need to be fluent. And there's some really raw business imperatives around that, then it begins, and there's no getting off that train.
I feel that companies such as yours need to be supported in their path. And I'm sure that many listeners are asking themselves the question, how they can personally support you, your organization. So what can we do personally, apart from organizations that are listening to this podcast, but personally, what can we do to support Austral Fisheries?
This is the chance for a shameless plug here, Barbara. I should have had the slide ready. It's like there's a number of branded products. A lot of our banana prawns end up in supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths. Karumba branded banana prawns, great product, ready to eat in the freezer cabinet. That's going really well. This Glacier 51 toothfish is an extraordinary, mainly fine dining meal. It is available in retail, and we also have Skull Island branded tiger prawns, which are going pretty well. But circling back on that, and yes, thanks for anyone who would choose to support us. But I think the other thing to realise is that this whole journey, it is about if not me, who, if not now, when. it's sobering to think that we need to halve emissions each decade now, forever. And I do find more often than not, there's a lot of head nodding when it comes to, yes, that's a good idea. Yes, Albo's got his 43% reduction. That's a good idea. And then it's go and hook the 4-wheel drive up to the caravan and bugger off like I did last year. So somebody else can do the heavy lifting. And so it comes down to individual choices. How are we individually going to make a difference? When that gas hot water system dies, then put in a heat pump. And if you haven't got solar panels, get on with it. Think hard about a domestic battery. Look at your electric vehicle. Think about how much flying you do, your protein choices, and again, as the advice was that we offered for business, so you should live that advice, because that cognitive dissonance is really obvious. So, you talk about, and you're very flattering in the description of the business, but this business is an extension of me. So I own an electric car. I've got the home, and the privilege, right? I in that position, I got the home battery. Yes, I fly around on airplanes, but we do offset that. I'm learning to fly an electric airplane only because I've always wanted to fly, but I could never justify using fuel for that indulgence. And I love the projects that we're involved with. So you find, this is again centre self, like I'm the real deal. It's like what you see, the corporate David is personal David. Personal David is corporate David. And so if there is that dissonance between how you turn up to work and what you do in your private life, then I encourage you to look hard at yourself.
And I like that you have such authentic leadership. I do have to confess, I also suffer from this cognitive dissonance. I often find myself flying to all sorts of places to speak about climate action to businesses. And I also feel, even though we offset those flights, that it's questionable. It's a questionable practice. So I really appreciate you talking that openly and honestly about both your personal and business experience. Now we've almost run out of time, and I've got one final question to ask. If people want to find out more, how can they connect with you or Austral Fisheries?
LinkedIn's good. You can maybe put my LinkedIn connection on wherever you post this. LinkedIn's probably a good place. So if I'm up to stuff, it tends to be on there.
Excellent. So we'll put your LinkedIn profile and the web address and email address for Austral Fisheries in the show notes of this episode. Now, unfortunately, we've for now definitely run out of time. Really appreciate you spending time with me this afternoon. Actually, for you, it's still morning.
Still good morning, yes.
I really appreciate the time you spent with me, David. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Barbara. It's been a pleasure.
That was David Carter, CEO of Austral Fisheries, talking about their journey towards net zero emissions. If you know another person who you think will enjoy this podcast, please let them know so that more people can hear about best practice stories of how organizations are moving to net zero emissions. Remember, to reach net zero emissions, aim high, always be curious, and act now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode.